Hi, this is Stephen again, and in this video I'm going to follow up from a previous video about the bouncing ball animation that I've been doing. And I wanted to kind of point out that in this one I kind of messed up. I wanted to specifically mess up some things in the timing and the arcs to show you how to fix that. So the first thing that I'm going to do is kind of point out what's going on. And usually in this ball bounce, you have to think about the ball bouncing from the top of this arc. Is it falling off something? Is it sort of rolling off? Is it, being thrown? At what point is this first arc, if this is sort of a traditional bouncing ball? It could be finishing up from a previous bounce, which is fine, or it's falling off. But just to kind of point this out, if it does that, unless it's being thrown to the ground, if it's sort of rolling off something and dropping and hitting the ground, the next bounce is going to be at least half of the previous bounce. So right now it's more than half the previous bounce. And then this next bounce is a lot lower. So it's losing energy a lot more. So technically the ball bounce would lose energy in an exponential way, but I'm just going to kind of gauge it that the height of this needs to be about half the previous one. So I'm going to use the sub-selection tool. And since I already have keyframes on this, I am going to just kind of pull these down. So if I pull them really far down, you see these handles here that I'd created on these points where the ball hits the ground are kind of pulling this back up, right? So it's going to do this kind of weird path. But I'm going to go to about half, and I want to make each one of these arcs sort of about the same. So I'm going to hold down Option. If these tangent handles are broken, I need to hold down Option to keep them that way, right? To move them around. If I don't, they're going to be locked together. Like I want these locked together because, it should be equal on either side. And I really want to kind of make sure that these handles are equidistant from that point on the top. And I want to make it a nice arc to it. Now the second one, I'm going to move the ball out of the way a little bit. I'm going to select this, and I want to make sure that this is about half that distance, right? Which it's a little bit more than half, so I can bring that down a little bit. And I'm going to zoom in just to kind of get the idea here that the space between here and here where the ball hits the ground and the top of this bounce here, it's going to be about half that distance, right? So double the distance of this should be about there. So that one's pretty good. I mean, I can go up a little bit. It doesn't have to be exact, but that's kind of the general idea. And then on this one, I'm going to bring these handles in just a little bit. I do want to make sure that the handles on either side, grab the whole thing there, are about the same height, right? So if I select this middle one, I can see, the height of the previous two. So if I, select this one, you can't necessarily see that, but here, and if this seems like it's being pushed out too much, then I just bring these handles in and I just make sure they're sort of equidistant from one another, right? And that's just kind of making sure that these arcs are arcing in sort of a natural way for a bouncing ball. And really this one is going to be it's going to be a kind of a mini version of this one. And then this one, I'm going to bring that up a little bit. Bring these handles in just a little bit. Bring these handles in just a little bit. Kind of make it a mini version of the previous one to a certain degree. And then this one, I'm going to, let's say I bring that one in just a little bit. Whoop, I don't need to hold down Option for that. Right. So I'm just kind of making these, each bounce sort of a mini version of the previous one. And that's about half. And if you need to get really close in there, you can zoom in and, make sure that that's about right. You can just eyeball it. It doesn't need to be exact, but pretty close. And so when I do that, I'm going to zoom back out. I should have some pretty good arcs going all throughout, and you can kind of see in an exponential way, this is half, this is half, this is half, this is half. So if you kept going half, it would never end up stopping its bounce. So eventually you get to a point where it's minimum energy and it rolls off. And in this case, I just have it stop on that last bounce. So I'm going to play through. And now I've got some pretty good arcs going with that and some pretty good spacing. The other thing to point out is on each bounce, the distance between this point and this point is always going to be less as you move out. So that's the spacing of the bounce. So this one is going to be less than that, right? I gauge it about 75% or 3/4 of the previous bounce. The bounces are going to get shorter and shorter as we go through. So now that I've got that kind of spaced out, and I already kind of did that where each one is a little bit less than the previous one, right? And then eventually it would just kind of roll off, but I'm just having it stop at frame 150, right? With 4 bounces, 1, 2, 3, 4, well, 5. So the other thing about this is you got to make sure before you start getting further into this, that make sure that these handles, right? This is what's controlling slow in and slow out. So if you've got some weird timing issues, there's a couple things that could go on. You've got to make sure that this keyframe is centered between this bounce and this bounce. Otherwise, it's going to go slower here and then faster here. So we're going to make sure that that's, roughly half. And my first bounce here was frame 21. So the next one, I'm just going to knock it down. Each one, I just kind of knock down about 1 frame and then sort of change these a little bit, right? And this one seems like it wasn't in between these two, and maybe this one could be over 1. So that the height of each bounce is about halfway between each, the previous bounce and the next bounce, right? Or the next time it hits the ground. So that'll give you some nice timing and spacing and a good arc. Now the other thing that we're going to add, we're going to do a couple different things to liven up this animation. The first thing I want to do is I'm going to actually edit the ball to give it a nice design, right? So if I double click on it, I'm usually going to get into the edit mode, but I have to choose the selection tool and then double click, and then I can edit that symbol. That's one of the easiest ways to edit the symbol. The other way you could do it is if you're on the main timeline, the whatever scene, and I called my scene example. If you go to the library, you can actually see that symbol, and I can double click that symbol and then edit the symbol as well. So I'm going to give it a good design, right? And again, I'll call this background or back. But I can take a couple different symbols. I'm going to make another layer. And let's say I can kind of take, and I don't necessarily like those colors, but I'm going to select that. And then let's zoom in a little bit. And then I can modify that symbol a little bit. Let's say, I can make it sort of a roundish shape on the inside. If you want, you can make it look like some, a ball that, like a basketball or a tennis ball, or, something that's got kind of a neat design to it. I did already design one, and I'm going to show you what I can do if I didn't like, kind of how this is going, but I still had it animated. So let's say, I was getting to this point and I'm like, I'm not really fond of this ball, even though I'm kind of liking what's going on. I'm going to change the color just a little bit. Let's give it a nice bright color. So let's say I got to that point and I thought, well, I'm going to design a new one. So I go over to the library and you can actually right click and make a new symbol, which is kind of what I did here. I made the symbol of this ball. So I designed this to kind of get an idea of, just a different kind of shape. And I didn't want to spend too much time designing it through the video, but you can do a lot of different things. And I created it just by going to a different shape, and you can actually copy it and paste it around and, rotate it if you want. It's kind of what you could do here is if I had one of these in the center, you can actually change that pivot point, to the center, and then duplicate it and then move it around. And then that way you can rotate it wherever you want. So that's kind of how I created this design. And I created it in layers. I gave it some accents and a pattern around there and did the background for it. And I think it's a much better design. So, but I'm going to go back to my example. And what I can do is you can actually replace this symbol. So I started with this one, which is an okay design. It's not a bad design. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace it. I'm going to select it. I'm going to right click, and I'm going to go to swap symbol. And when I do that, it's actually going to give me this little window. And in this window, it's going to show you all the symbols that are in the library. So I'm going to choose symbol 1. And I'm going to click OK, and now it has replaced that symbol that I had originally with this animation and just replaced the symbol. The animation's still there, and it's still going along. So it hasn't affected the animation. I just swapped out the symbol. So it's one thing that you can do. You can make one, and if you don't like it, you can make another and swap it out. And actually, you can duplicate this, and there's a lot of things that you could do with the motion here. So, but starting from there, one thing I want to kind of show is, let's say I wanted to extend this animation a little bit. I didn't like where it was ending up and I wanted to change that. I can actually just go to the free transform tool and choose that path that's on the scene or the stage, and I could just drag it out, and then I can move it around if I want. Right, so I can I don't have to completely redo all my animation if I just want to scale it up or move it around, or, even if I wanted to scale it in. And if I want, and I always wanted to start from here, and I wanted to scale it up, I can move that pivot point there and then scale it this way if I wanted to. So it's a good way to kind of just change your animation around pretty quickly, if I wanted to fill up more of the scene. So I'm going to do that, kind of have that all set up, and I can play it through. And I've got this animation with this new ball that I created or designed, right? Now what I'm going to end up doing is adding what's called squash and stretch, which is one of those principles of animation. And what's going to happen is when it hits the ground, I am going to have it squash down, which means I'm not morphing the ball, so I'm not using a shape tween on this, which we'll have in a future video. I'll talk about shape tweening. But for this, what I'm going to do, just because I just need to scale it down and scale it out, is that squash and stretch. So right now when it hits the ground, there's a couple things that I want to do. The first thing is every time it hits the ground, when it goes to squash, I want it to hold on the ground a little bit. So when it squashes, it's going to touch down and then it's going to do the squash. And I'll talk about this on each step. But so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to option drag this one over, this keyframe over. So, and right now it's going to hold. You're going to see this little loop here just because it did a little loop from one to the other, but it's just on one frame, so it doesn't look like it moves. And I'm going to do this for every one of them. Option drag that over every time it bounces, except for the smaller bounces. And on this one, I'll drag it one over, but on the last one, I'll leave it. Right, so what that's going to do is it's going to hold it down for one frame. You're going to see it kind of like sticks to the ground a little bit. And the reason why I'm doing that is on the second bounce, I'm going to add squash and stretch. The steps I do this are I select the ball first. I'm going to use the transform panel. You could use the free transform tool and pull that down and pull it out. And the reason I'm doing both, the reason it goes down and out, is the squash is not just scaling it down. We don't want to lose volume in this ball, so it's got to go down and out, and pretty much the same ratio. So you'll see it here, it goes out 144.9% and then 57% down, which is somewhat equivalent to the same ratio going out as down, right? And we can fix it later if it doesn't necessarily do that. What you'll notice in that is that at the top, it's at 100% by 100%. So if I select the ball, it is 100% of its original size on both the height and the width. Then it starts to squash before it hits the ground, which is not realistic. What I want to do, and you'll see this in a lot of traditional animation where the ball is falling to the ground and it starts to stretch. There's a good reason for this. The ball isn't going to anticipate the ground. So if it stretches in this way, and I'll go ahead and add it, I'm just going like a couple frames before the squash. I'm actually going to, that's where it touches down the first and it holds, right? So I'm going to go a couple frames back. I'm going to select the ball, and then I'm going to take it and go the opposite direction. So, and actually I'm going to just type it in. I'm going to go 50% and I'll go 150%, which is a lot, right? But then I can scale it back down. I can do that. So I just wanted to sort of start touching the ground. And now when it does this, I see how the orientation of this cage, the bounding box around the ball, is straight. That's because its angle is keeping it that way, right? That's the angle of the ball, and it's set at a sort of a 90-degree angle to the ground, or parallel to the ground. So what I want to do is kind of back it up just a little bit. And so when it's going to hit the ground, I want it to be 90 degrees or parallel to the ground, right? So it's just kind of turning just a little bit. And then I'm gonna come back up here and I'm gonna back it up just a little bit. So I'm gonna go to about right there. And what this is gonna do is you're gonna see, and it's one of the reasons I have a design and pattern on the ball, you're gonna see that rotation kind of follows along the path and it starts to stretch right in here, right? And actually I'm gonna stretch it out just a little bit because I think it's losing a little bit too much volume. meaning the height and width ratio is a little different. So I'm going to have it just stretch just a little bit before it hits the ground. And then here, right when it touches the ground, I'm going to make it 100%. I know it seems like a lot of back and forth, but the reason why is I want it to look like it's stretching here, and then it goes to 100%, and then it stretches, right? And then on that second bounce, I'm going to drag it down just a little bit. So when I pop it back and forth, I should see the bottom of that ball still at the same position, right? I think it's a little off, so I'm going to bring this down just a little bit. There. See how it looks like the ball hits the ground, and then the second one, it squashes into the ground. And this is due to physics. Really, the ball, when it squashes, it's hitting the ground with force, and the ground is not going to move unless it's a really soft ground. We're thinking it's like asphalt or something hard that the ball is striking. And why it's doing that is the ball is compressing into the ground. It's made of a substance that allows it to compress on the ground. Now, if it's a bowling ball, it's probably not going to do that unless it's an animated bowling ball. You might want to add a little squash and stretch. But if you wanted to make it look more rigid, you probably don't want to put too much squash and stretch. If I want to make this look like a rubber ball, then yeah, I want to add some accentuated and some exaggerated squash, right? Now, this stretch is not the same principle. There's nothing physical that's really happening with the ball when it's dropping to the ground other than the fact that it's moving really fast. As I look at it, the ball is actually stretching because of what's called motion blur, which is an artifact of what happens in some cameras. And it's actually used as a creative thing in animation, where animators would actually animate motion, things that were moving in motion. They would actually smear it so it looked like it was camera blur. It was blur from the camera. And that's what we're doing here. We're making it look like it's moving so fast that it blurs, right? And so we have, I'm going to go back to fit in window. So we have the ball at 100%. It starts to drop, right? It actually gets to this point, it stretches, but I need to go back a few frames because it shouldn't be stretching all the way through. What I want to do is then take it back to 100%. Again, I know this is a lot of back and forth in terms of setting it 100% there and then setting it to stretch and then setting it to 100% and then going to squash. But you'll see the reason why once it starts to move in full speed. So I'm going to, it's squashing there, right? So I have this stretch. It's 100% there, 100% there. It stretches back to 100%, and then in one frame it squashes. Then I'm going to go a couple more frames, and then I want to stretch it back out again, right? And what I could do is I could just take this one that's being stretched, and I can option drag it over. A couple more. Let me do that again. Option drag it over. Now what it did come with it was the rotation, so I need to then rotate it back, and then we're going to see this thing squash and stretch, and then a couple more frames it's got to return back to 100%. So again, I know it's a lot of back and forth in terms of getting it to come back and forth to 100%, but it's very important that it stays, it maintains the shape of the ball, then starts to stretch, goes to back to it. It's going through this. I really don't necessarily need that frame, but I want to make it look like it's 100% right when it hits the ground. And then I can have it stretch. And then I can have it squash, back to stretch, back to 100%. Right? And I want to do that before it reaches the apex. Now I might want to time that out just a little bit. Let's see how that looks. Boom. Right? And now we get that idea that it's actually a physical thing hitting the ground, squashing and stretching. And it's pretty quick, but you can perceive it, right? It makes it look a little rubbery. So now I just go to the next bounce and I do the same thing. So I've got this rotating. You'll notice it wants to come back, or it's staying that same rotation. What I want it to do is sort of follow along this path. So I'm going to look at this dot right here, and you'll notice it's here. Right? The rotation's the same. Here it was here and it rotated, right? So I'm going to get it to this point, and then I'm going to come here, and because of the way that I've animated this ball, or I've set it up, when I squash and stretch it, it needs to be these lines that are, when I use this free transform tool, need to be parallel with the ground. So I'm going to rotate it back this way, and you're going to see that it follows along the path of the ball, or that follows along the path of that arc. So then when it's here, I'm again going to squash it. So, and I probably don't need it as much as the previous one, so it's probably a little too much. Bring it up just a little bit. I'm going to bring this here, and then going back one frame, and actually I'll go back a few more frames. Let's go here, and then select the ball 100% by 100%. You can always just use the free transform tool, but this way I know it's getting back to 100%. And make sure this is off, by the way. This locks them together, so if I scale it one way, it would scale the same way, but I don't want that, so I have it unlocked. Right, then I'm going to go a few more frames. I'm going to stretch the ball, stretch it out just a little bit. That might be too much. Right, just a little bit to give that kind of sense of motion blur. And I'm going to, let's stretch it out. I'm going to go, because it should be about there maybe. There we go. And now it squashes. And actually I'm going to go here, set that to 100% again. That's right before it squashes. Sorry, yeah, right after it squashes. There's the squash, 100% squash, 100% stretch. And now I'm going to go a few more frames. And again, I can grab that where it's stretching and option drag it over if I want. You don't have to, but it's one way to do it. And I think it definitely needs to be off the ground when it stretches. And now I need to rotate it towards the direction of the curve, right? A few more frames, and then again I can grab this or this one and option drag and get that to 100%, right? And then you'll notice that it's bouncing, but it's rotating back the other direction because I haven't set the next rotation. So I'm going to go here and then rotate it this way, 90 degrees, just so when it hits the ground again, it's going to be stretched. Whoop. I'm going to zoom into it here. Didn't want to line up very properly, so I just zoom in to get it that way. Whoop. I have it going the opposite direction. Let's see. That way. So I want to go this way. Right? And again, if it doesn't want to cooperate, I just zoom in and then I can get it to line up. And then I have it rotating too many times. There. So I can make it, let's fix that just a little bit. I went too far the previous time. Right. And then when I look at that, well, it just does not. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna fix it down here. So I'm going to go to the motion editor and I'm going to go down to rotation, and you'll notice this animation curve goes jetting off down here, which when on rotation, it should always be rotating in the same direction. So when I rotated it, what ended up happening is I rotated it back around beyond probably 360. So then it went the other direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch to this 400%. And actually I'm going to go to that point. And I'm going to reset this to 0, right? And then I can actually select this point. There we go. So you got to be on that Z. And now I'm going to take this and move it up. And then I'm going to move this way. And actually I'll clean these up eventually, but now I get it to go that direction. Get it to go the right direction, right? So you can make the ball rotate as much as you want, as long as when it lands, it's in a 90-degree increment. So when it lands here, when it's in its squash, it needs to be in 90-degree increments. So it could be 90, and then it should be 180 right there. Right? That way it's going to be level with the ground. So that's why I do it in 90-degree increments. But you'll have this idea now. And I just keep animating the same way. And then I've got that squash and stretch right there, right? Squash, It's stretching before it hits the ground, comes back to 100%. Then on that second key, it squashes as it's leaving the air. It cannot still be on the ground when it starts to stretch because it's rebounding. The energy is causing the ball to rebound into the air, and then it's got to get to its stretch position. And then it wants to seek its original position. It wants to go back to its original size. So it's going to go back to here. Now, what I can do for rotation, because, we can see if that one's probably pretty accurate, but this one, we could actually probably just move it or get rid of it because it's just going through that rotation. So I can actually select these points for rotation, and I can actually delete them, right? Because they're just getting to that point. I just want to make sure that it rotates to get to that point. I don't necessarily need that key because it's just going straight. Same thing here is I can just get rid of that key. I want the one where it's on the ground. I don't necessarily need this one. You can keep it if you want, but I like to kind of clean it up because I want that motion to be sort of mostly uninterrupted, right? And then there we go for that rotation. Now in the scale X and Y, I want to kind of point this out. This is what's causing our squash and stretch. So you'll notice that this is 100% when that first key that I see on the X and Y is 100%. Then it goes to its squash position. Then it goes to its stretch position, back to 100%, to squash, out to stretch, and then back to 100%. So it's going to look like this heart rate monitor, but the middle line here is always going to be back to 100%. And what you should see between the X and the Y is sort of the reverse. Now at 100%, they're both, it's full size. So when you're scaling them out, you want to maintain volume. So if you're going out in the Y or up in the Y, you'd go down in the X. You can see on the other side, it's down in the X. And pretty much the same ratio. Now I don't necessarily need to add slow in, slow out to this. I could if I wanted to get kind of a nice little look to it. But it's not important because it's happening kind of fast, right? But I could just add a couple little handles if I wanted to. But it's going to happen so fast that it's going to be hardly perceptible. The other thing to watch out for is on the second bounce, you're going to notice that it's not as high of an increment, right? It's not going to be as big a squash and stretch as the first bounce. So I can actually go in here and grab these points and bring them up a little bit. As long as the X and the Y look sort of opposite, right? As one goes up, the other one goes down, right? And it's going to be the same thing when I get to the next couple bounces. So I'm just going to look at this. Boom, boom, right? And nice squash and stretch. The first one's definitely much more exaggerated than the second one. It's just because it's losing energy and it goes throughout. So these little loops, by the way, don't be concerned about it. It's happening in one frame. Right? It's just because it's in between that frame and that frame. If you were to space these out, you would see the ball go in the air, but because they're right next to one another, that is really just happening in one frame. So you don't even see it move because it's just happening in one frame. But that's how to get the rotation and the squash and stretch going. And now I just keep going and finish that out. I'd go to the next one, rotate it, then add the squash and stretch, go back and set it to 100% here, add more stretch, do the squash, add stretch again, go back to 100%, make sure that rotation's right. So that's how to finish it up and get a nice little polish for the entire bouncing ball. You can see that these don't do it so much, or not at all, because I didn't finish that up, but I would eventually get to that and finish that up. But this shows you how I can kind of get the first one and second one, now go ahead and add the third and the fourth, right? So I hope this helps, and good luck with it.